Hi, I'm Steve Banker, Vice President of Supply Chain Services at ARC Advisory Group. I'm here with Alex Pradhan of John Galt Solutions. Alex is a product strategy leader at John Galt. Alex, thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk with me.
Thank you for having me here, Steve.
You bet. Now, you and I both pay a lot of attention to supply chain management, and I'm starting to get questions from friends and acquaintances. They're starting to say, is this supply chain disruption all over? I don't see the product shortages anymore. We're not seeing pictures of boats at the docks. Are things better now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think certainly in the last several years, things have gotten better, but we're not out of the woods. What we've observed in the last several years is we are certainly seeing a lot more disruptions. We're seeing more uncertainty and risks, but organizations need to fundamentally reshift the way that shift the way that they're thinking about supply chain. We've seen a lot of companies are reflecting a lot on how they've done things in the past, but the world is changing very quickly. And you and I have talked a lot about a lot of what are the newer technologies, what are best practices, but with this world and how we're moving about. It really is requiring companies to radically rethink about how they're going to be moving in this new world. We got a lot more data that's coming in. You have to be looking at new internal factors, external factors, and resiliency is a big topic. I mean, I was sitting on one of the sessions, and resiliency, agility is being thrown around a lot, and so really organizations need to start to think a lot more about this new way of the world.
Yeah, what I tell folks, right, is it's better than it was for the last few years, but supply chain management's never going to be like it was 10 or 15 years ago. We're just not going to have that smooth, predictable supply chain flow. So like you mentioned, agility and resilience are coming up in conversations. Is there a difference between those two? How do you define agility and resilience?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about resiliency, there's you could argue that resiliency is being used. There's a lot of ways to think about resiliency. I'll talk about from a technology perspective. I think resiliency you could look at from a perspective of we have, for example, digital twins and what if scenarios to help you look at your supply chain and give you a lot more of a way to look at all of the different being able to model and factor all the different interdependencies and the way that the supply chain is being very dynamic and give you a lot more of a fluid way to look at the trade-offs that are happening in the supply chain. From an agility perspective, being able to get closer to the supply chain, being able to sense and respond and act a lot faster. But I don't know, Steve, if that's really what we should be asking ourselves. I think there's a lot more tension between if we should be looking at resiliency versus efficiency, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. And that's historically what we've done, right? Supply chain has always been, how can I run the most efficient supply chain to generate the most money possible?
Correct.
Okay. And now you're saying that's not how we should be thinking about it.
I'm not saying that's not how we should not be thinking about it, but I guess what I would argue is that with many supply chains historically have been very much focused on being very, very efficient and being very focused on very functional ways of thinking, very looking at efficiency, which is not a bad thing, but I think there needs to also be a balance on looking at that resiliency as well. So going back to looking at digital twins, looking at what if scenarios, there has to be this balance as well.
And certainly supply chain planning solutions allow you to run scenarios in a way no human being could ever do. They just can't, we can't do a million variables in our head and do the math. Now you've been using the term digital twin.
Correct.
Could you define that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So for if someone is not familiar with the term digital twin, it's in its simplest form, it is a real-time virtual replica of your physical supply chain. So think of it as a mirror. It is going to go ahead and capture all of the relationships and the interdependencies of the physical supply chain. So now you're able to go ahead and understand the relationships, the interdependencies. You're able to go ahead and model and look at all of the different elements, and using scenarios, you can go ahead and look at the different trade-offs as well. So it really enables the users to understand what are the different trade-offs that are happening across whether it's service or capacity or profitability as well. So, going back to the question about resiliency, enabling organizations to understand, well, what do I do now with, for example, my network, or what is the best way that I should go ahead and serve up an order? So now you're really looking at your entire supply chain end to end, but in real time. And I think that's really, really important when we're talking about resiliency, is how do I look at my entire supply chain and my entire network in real time? And that is really, really important as we go into the future. Again, going back to that first question about, how do we prepare going into the future? It's really is, let's get all of this data. Let's make sure that we're modeling our supply chain in real time to give us this ability to support and be able to shift for what's coming, and be able to prepare and be more flexible, when all these disruptions are coming.
Right. Yeah. Well, historically, we've done return on investment research on supply chain planning. Almost always payback period in less than 2 years. At the same time, you have happier customers. They're getting better service, and you're giving them better service at a lower cost, which can mean better sales. So, tremendous solution. I don't think people fully understand the power of this solution. But I want to go back to this idea of a digital twin. When I hear digital twin, the other term that pops into my mind is digital transformation. How does the supply chain, how does transforming a supply chain help a company do a full end-to-end digital transformation?
So a digital transformation, I think there's multiple elements to it. You've got certainly technology, right? And we talked a little bit about that, but you've got data, you've got people, and you've got the process side of things. I think if we look at, what is a digital transformation, that's one of those terms that's thrown around a lot. But I think what's really important and a key element is this idea of innovation and experimentation as well, and especially for very those organizations that are much more mature, further along in their journey. What we see and we observe a lot is this fusion of the physical and the digital world. So that idea of the digital twin, we're using very advanced analytics like AI and machine learning, or even leveraging more advanced what-if scenarios, or these much more advanced concepts. But ultimately, it's about being able to link and put together, going outside of the four walls of the organization. This idea of connecting and collaborating and orchestrating across the ecosystem, and that really is when we talk about digital transformation, is being able to transform radically the business model to generate value. And so that is, to me, going back to how do you link together, technology, data, people, process, and that data, that is, I guess, the holy grail of where we want to move organizations, where we see that power putting all of that together. So I don't know if that answers your question, Steve.
I think it does.
But I think it's incredibly powerful to be able to do that and go there.
Yeah. I'm getting the high sign that we should be wrapping up here pretty quickly.
Yes.
So, John Galt Solutions is a supply chain planning vendor. A lot of people haven't heard of you. You guys are moving up in the Magic Quadrant. You're you're moving up fast. I know you guys are getting a lot more attention. Real quickly, how would you say, from a supply chain planning perspective, your solution is differentiated?
Sure. I think there's a couple of key elements, but the one that's the most important is from an area of there's we help organizations help address their most critical operational challenges while positioning them for transformational outcomes. And I can talk all day probably about technology, but it's not just about technology. It's also about enabling them, organizations, to support their business processes. And I think an area that we really do well is to support their digital transformation. And I talked a little bit about that, but it's of course not just about technology, but it's about also enabling companies to support them in their their transformation. And that's an area that we've excelled, and helping them also automate. I think that's an area where one of our guiding principles is supporting automation. In today's world, we hear a lot about companies have to do a lot more with less, whether it's less time, less resources, or less capital. And that's something that, we are very much focused on helping companies help them to do more with less.
Beautiful. Thank you so much,
Thank you for
Alec.
your time today.
You bet. This is Steve Banker with ARC, and I've been talking to Alex Pradhan of John Galt Solutions. Thank you very much.